There are questions that look like one thing and are another thing entirely. Questions that arrive wearing the costume of small talk, of casual professional exchange, of the ordinary social navigation that fills the air between people who are performing a version of intimacy for an audience. Questions that the person asking believes to be simple, and that the person receiving understands, in the fraction of a second before the answer is required, to be the most complicated thing they have been asked in years. Robin Williams was asked one of these questions on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1996, on the set of a network talk show in Los Angeles, in front of a studio audience and a camera that was broadcasting to several million people who had tuned in expecting to watch someone very funny be very funny for 30 minutes. The host was a man named David Kellner. The question was, what scares you most? What happened in the next 8 seconds, the pause, the half-laugh, the recovery, the redirect, has been analyzed and described and speculated about in the years since, by people who were in the studio audience, and by people who were watching at home, and by journalists who have written about Robin Williams' public and private life. The analysis tends to focus on the pause, on what the pause might have contained, on what Robin Williams almost said before he decided not to. But the analysis misses the most important part of the story, because the most important part of the story is what Robin Williams said during the commercial break, and what David Kellner did with it afterward. David Kellner had been hosting his afternoon talk show for 7 years by 1996. He was good at his job in the specific way that a certain kind of television host is good at their job: affable, quick, skilled at making guests feel comfortable while remaining entirely in control of the conversation, capable of moving from topic to topic with a seamlessness that concealed the degree of preparation and management happening beneath the apparent spontaneity. He had interviewed Robin Williams twice before. He understood, in the way that experienced interviewers understand things about their subjects through the accumulated evidence of repeated exposure, that Robin Williams was a specific kind of interview challenge. Not difficult in the combative sense, not withholding in the way of someone protecting something specific, but constitutionally resistant to the kind of direct personal engagement that television interviews were designed to produce. Not because he was private, he was not particularly private about most things, but because the velocity of his public persona made it genuinely difficult to find the ground beneath it. Every question became a performance opportunity, and the performances were so extraordinary that people forgot they had asked a question. David Kellner had spent several days preparing for the 1996 interview. He had, in his own words, in a piece he wrote years later for a television industry publication, decided to try something different. I had spent 2 previous interviews watching Robin turn every question into a comedy routine, which was spectacular and entirely useless if you were trying to find out who he actually was. I decided to ask him something simple enough that the comedy routine wouldn't quite fit, something that required a genuine answer. What scares you most? He expected a joke. He had prepared for a joke. His follow-up questions were designed to work whether Robin answered sincerely or deflected into comedy. He was not prepared for the pause. The pause lasted approximately 8 seconds. In television terms, this is a significant pause, long enough for a production director to reach for the cutaway camera, long enough for the floor manager to make eye contact with the host and signal concern, long enough for the studio audience to shift in that specific way. Audiences shift when something has moved outside the expected parameters of what they came to see. Robin Williams looked at David Kellner. Then he made a sound that was close to a laugh, but was not quite a laugh. A sound that several people who were in the studio audience that afternoon have described as one of the most uncomfortable sounds they ever heard. A performer make in a live setting. Not because it was distressing exactly, but because it was almost a laugh, and then didn't become one. It stopped in the middle of becoming itself and turned into something that had no name. And then Robin Williams answered a different question. He said something about fear of flying, which he did not have, and which was such an obvious deflection that the studio audience laughed at the audacity of it, which was probably the point. He said something else. something funnier, and the momentum of the interview resumed, and David Kellner asked his follow-up questions, and the remaining 20 minutes of the show were exactly what the viewers at home had tuned in to watch. But David Kellner had seen the pause. He had been looking directly at Robin Williams when it happened, from a distance of approximately 4 feet, and he had seen something in those 8 seconds that he has described, across the years since, with the same words in every account. He said, "I saw someone who had the answer and decided not to give it. Not someone who didn't know the answer. Not someone who was searching for the answer. Someone who had it immediately, completely. The way certain questions reach directly into the place where the true answer lives, without requiring any excavation, and chose, in the 8 seconds between the question and the recovery, not to give it." The show went to commercial. The commercial break lasted 4 minutes. In the controlled environment of a television production, 4 minutes is a specific quantity of time enough for the makeup artist to attend to the host and the guest, for the floor manager to review the remaining segment, for the producers in the control room to make any necessary adjustments to the running order. David Kellner did not follow the standard commercial break procedure. He leaned toward Robin Williams. He said, quietly enough that the boom operator who had repositioned during the break would later say he could hear the words but couldn't make out their content, "You don't have to tell me, but I'm asking you the same question. Not for the show. Just me. Asking you." There was a moment. Robin Williams looked at David Kellner, the way people look at someone who has just done something unexpected, not threatening, not intrusive, just unexpected. The look of a person recalibrating. Then he answered. He spoke for approximately 3 minutes, in a voice that the makeup artist later described as entirely different from his on-camera voice, not lower exactly, but slower, and without the characteristic rhythm that his public speech always had, the rhythm that was itself a kind of performance structure. He spoke in a voice that the makeup artist, who had worked in television for 15 years and had been in rooms with hundreds of famous people, said she had never heard come out of Robin Williams before or after. What he said, the specific content of the 3 minutes, is known to a small number of people who were in the studio during the commercial break. David Kellner has never fully disclosed it. The makeup artist, a woman named Susan Okafor who left the television industry in 2001 and has lived in Vermont since, has spoken about it once, in a conversation that was not recorded, that she later described in writing to a friend. None of these accounts reproduce what Robin Williams actually said, word for word. They converge on a description of the subject matter, and the subject matter is consistent across all accounts. He talked about disappearing, not in the dramatic sense, not about self-harm, not about crisis in any clinical formulation, but in the specific, almost philosophical sense of a person who has built an existence so visible, so public, so consistently directed outward, that the interior version of that person, the one who existed before the visibility, who was there in the quiet rooms of a Michigan childhood, who had generated all of this from some place that was now very hard to locate, had become difficult to find. He talked about the fear that the person he actually was might have become inaccessible, not lost, not gone, just somewhere, behind the performance, behind the velocity, behind the decades of being Robin Williams, in a world that had very specific requirements about what being Robin Williams meant, somewhere he could not always reach. He was afraid, David Kellner wrote, years later, of not being able to find himself, not of anything external, of the interior distance, of what happened when you looked inside and couldn't see clearly. The commercial break ended. The floor manager counted down. Robin Williams looked at the camera and became Robin Williams again, which he did with the specific, practiced ease of someone putting on a coat they have worn for 30 years. The second half of the interview was, by audience response and subsequent ratings, the best half. Robin Williams was incandescent. He was everything the viewers had come to see. David Kellner watched him and thought about the 3 minutes. The tape from that day exists. The broadcast version is archived, as all broadcast content is archived. The commercial break was not recorded in the broadcast archive. Commercial breaks are not typically recorded in the standard production process. But there was, on that particular set, a secondary camera that was running continuously, capturing a wide shot of the interview set for the purpose of a behind-the-scenes segment that the production was preparing about its own process. The secondary camera captured the commercial break. The producer who reviewed the behind-the-scenes footage several days after the interview was a woman named Karen Bright, who had been with David Kellner's show for 4 years. She reviewed hours of footage looking for material for the behind-the-scenes segment. She watched the commercial break footage. She did not use it in the behind-the-scenes segment. She transferred the relevant portion to a separate file, flagged it as production archive material, and made a note in the production log: not for broadcast, not for distribution, internal archive only. She told David Kellner what she had found. David Kellner asked her what she was going to do with it. Karen Bright said, "Nothing. It's not ours." David Kellner looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." He has said, in the years since, that Karen Bright's response in that moment was the most professionally ethical thing he witnessed in 7 years of television production. That she had understood, without being told, that what was on the footage was not content. That it was a private moment that happened to have been recorded by accident, and that the accidental recording did not convert the private moment into content. The footage exists in the production archive. It has never been broadcast. It has never been shared with anyone outside the production. Karen Bright confirmed its existence, its nature, and its continued archiving in a brief statement she made to a journalist in 2015 that was published in a small industry newsletter. The statement contained no details about what the footage showed. It confirmed only that the footage existed, that it had been made with Robin Williams's knowledge after he was informed of the secondary camera, and that it had been archived in accordance with his explicit request. He had been told about the secondary camera. He had been told during the commercial break by a crew member who approached him as part of the standard process of managing talent expectations about what was being recorded. He had said, "Keep it, just don't show it to anyone." He trusted them to do that. They did. David Kellner did not ask the question, "What scares you most?" in any interview after the spring of 1996. This was not a formal decision, not a publicized policy, not something he announced or explained in any professional context. It was simply a choice he made, and continued to make, across the remaining 11 years of his show, and in all of the interview work he did after the show ended. His producers noticed. Several of them asked, at various points, why the question had disappeared from his repertoire. It was a good question, the kind that produced strong answers, the kind that opened up guests who had been resistant to more conventional approaches. It was, in the language of television interview craft, a useful tool. David Kellner told them, on the occasions when the subject arose, that he had retired the question. He did not explain why. He explained, once, to a journalist who was writing a profile of him for a media industry publication in 2008, in terms that were precise enough to convey something meaningful without disclosing anything specific. "There are questions," he said, "that you realize, having asked them once, you should not have asked. Not because the answer was painful, it wasn't, not in the way you might imagine, but because you understood, once the person was answering, that you had accidentally gotten somewhere you weren't entitled to be, not by bad faith, by accident. And there's a kind of grace in recognizing that, in deciding not to do it again." The journalist asked if he could say more. David Kellner said, "No." Susan Okafor left the television industry in 2001. She had worked in makeup for 15 years, on dozens of productions, with hundreds of guests. She had been in rooms with famous people in the specific intimacy of the makeup chair, the closest professional proximity that television production creates. The chair where people sometimes said things they had not said elsewhere, because the act of being attended to, of having someone else's hands on their face, created a particular kind of lowered guard. She had heard things in that chair. She had held many of them privately, with the specific professional discretion that the job required. She has spoken about the 1996 interview twice, once in a conversation with a close friend, which she subsequently wrote about in a letter, portions of which have been shared with the friend's permission. Once to a writer who was researching a long-form piece on behind-the-scenes television work, in an interview that she asked not to be recorded. In both accounts, she described not what Robin Williams said. She declined to do that, but what she heard in his voice while he said it. She described the voice that was not his public voice. She described what it felt like to be in the room with someone who was speaking in that voice. In 15 years of makeup, she said, I heard a lot of famous people say things that the audience never heard. A lot of things they probably shouldn't have said, or said things they were going to regret. That wasn't that. What Robin Williams said in those 3 minutes was not something he shouldn't have said. It was something that was entirely true and that he had probably never said to anyone before. And the reason it was true and the reason he had never said it was that it required being asked by someone who asked it the right way and waited for the actual answer. She paused. David waited. He asked, and then he just waited. That's the whole thing. He waited for the answer that was actually there. Robin Williams was asked, in interviews conducted after 1996, various versions of the question about fear. He answered these questions in the way he always answered them, with comedy, with deflection that was itself a kind of performance, with the specific, energetic avoidance of a man who knew exactly how to redirect any line of inquiry that came too close to the place where the true answer lived. He was never asked, "What scares you most?" by David Kellner again. He appeared on Kellner's show twice more before the show ended. Both interviews were extraordinary. Robin Williams, at his most alive, most funny, most generously present. Both were exactly what they were supposed to be. In the second of these appearances, near the end of the interview, David Kellner leaned toward Robin Williams and said something that was not audible to the studio audience and was not caught by the production microphones. The secondary camera was not running that day. Whatever he said, Robin Williams looked at him for a moment. Then he smiled, not the performance smile, the one calibrated for cameras, but the smaller, more private smile that appeared when something had reached him. He nodded. The show went to commercial. David Kellner retired from television in 2007. He has given a small number of interviews since. In all of them, the 1996 Robin Williams interview is mentioned because it is part of the documented record of his show, and because journalists who cover television history tend to ask about memorable moments. In all of these interviews, David Kellner describes the broadcast portion of the interview as memorable and gives his assessment of Robin Williams as a guest. He does not describe the commercial break. He does not describe what was said. He does not describe the decision to retire the question. He answers the questions he is asked and does not volunteer what he has not been asked. He was asked, directly, once, by a journalist who had done enough research to know that something had happened during the commercial break that day. Yes, David Kellner said, something happened. He did not say what. The journalist asked if he would ever say. David Kellner was quiet for a moment. There are things, he said, that stay in the room they happened in, not because they're secret exactly, but because the room they happened in was a specific room, and the two people in it were specific people, and what passed between them belonged to that room and those people, and not to the record. Robin understood that. He was very clear about it. He said, "Keep it. Just don't show it to anyone." He paused. "He trusted us," David Kellner said. "That's the whole thing. He trusted us, and we didn't let him down. He did not ask the question again. He kept the answer in the room where it was given. And for a man who made his living asking people questions in public, that is the most revealing thing he ever said. Because the answer he chose to protect was not his. It was Robin Williams. And protecting it, holding it in the room, keeping it from the record, declining every invitation to let it out, was the most complete form of respect that a person who asks questions for a living can show for the person who answered. What scares you most? The answer existed. It was spoken. It was heard by 4 people in a television studio in Los Angeles in the spring of 1996. It was kept. It is kept still. And that is its own kind of answer to the question of who Robin Williams was, that he could trust a room full of people who made their living from disclosure to hold something private, that the trust was honored, that the room held it, that some answers are worth more kept than told.